there's a way to do this. Oh, what did I just do? All right. Alrighty. I'm gonna actually disable the waiting room. See what happens there. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. We'll see. Can everybody hear me? By the way, I kind of have my mic shoved up into between my two masks, and that usually tends to work. So cool. Got a thumbs up. Fantastic. And yes, cool. That's what I like to hear. Because unfortunately, I can only hear myself in my own face. So good, good. You have technical difficulties once, and then you live the rest of your Zoom life just fearing a terrible snafu of which you don't know is happening when it's happening. So just like to be extra sure. That's all. Alrighty. Cool, cool. Got 17 in here. It's a good number. Again, thank you all for coming. Let's see. Chat again, everybody. Just want everybody to stay muted until the end. We'll get through it. It's a lot of paintings. It was very difficult to kind of narrow it down to kind of a greatest hits, and then not even, because he had so many. We got a lot to get through though, and I really kind of, I don't want to say the art is secondary here, because it's not. It's impossible to talk about Van Gogh without talking about his art. But I want to kind of examine the personal side of his art, because I think looking at art is one thing, and you know, art doesn't exist in a vacuum, obviously, but sometimes it does. But I think his career was just so informed by who he was as a person that it's definitely worth, you know, kind of leaning into that pretty hard. And I think his life was very fascinating. So, all right, we got 17. That's a good number. All right, 3 after 7. I do have notes. I'm not, you know, like I said, I'm not an expert. I do have an art history degree, but there's a lot of artists. You can't remember everything about everybody. So occasionally I will be referring to these. So yeah, so I'm gonna, let's see, I'm gonna do share screen. I promise you I know what I'm doing. I have done this before. Multiple windows, oh no. Okay. All right. So let's get started here. Give me 1 second because I don't remember if I have to click or, okay, I do have to click. Oop. All right, so welcome everybody. This is something of a series that I'd like to continue doing going forward, called Meet the Artist. And in it, we're gonna kind of walk through some of art history's greatest hits, if you will. Also artists that I happen to be personally interested in. So, you know, it's for something that I like talking about as well. Just for some background, again, I do have a degree in art history, but that's a bachelor's. I have a master's in library science. I work here. My name is Nicole. I am the head of programming here for the library. And I just really like talking about art. Definitely what I would say one of my passions. And I think it's very easy to look at like the world of art and art history and just go like, oh, that's for like super scholarly, like rich people even. And it was for a very long time, but it shouldn't be, and it shouldn't have been. And I want everybody to have the opportunity to learn a little bit about the world around you. And art history is super cool because it's kind of like a visual history of the world. Again, Van Gogh, one of my faves, very interesting dude. And it's almost his birthday. So he was born in March 1853 and died in July of 1890. So not that old. He died at the age of 37. Spoiler, I guess. He's dead. Also, I will say I used to do this series at another library, and I had a poster up for Meet the Artist Andy Warhol, and somebody was like, "Is Andy Warhol gonna be there?" No, we're even if we do talk about a living artist one day, I don't have those kind of connections or money. So most of the ones that we're going to talk about in this series, hopefully will continue, are not living anyway. So Van Gogh's not here, unfortunately. So let's start. Our boy Vincent, Vinny. So a little bit of background on him, his childhood, his history, his family history. His family wasn't really wealthy. His uncle did own an art dealership that he did go to work at later in his teens. It was probably one of the bigger sources of income from his parents. They had 5 children. His mother was very strict, very religious, but he was encouraged to draw. He, they weren't like, hey, go make this a career, but, it's drawing as a hobby. Like I said, they had art dealers in the family, so it was definitely seen as something that was valuable, but not necessarily something you wanted to make a career out of it. But I will say, this sort of black cloud did sort of plague him his entire life because he was born a year to the day as the first Vincent van Gogh, who was his stillborn brother. So our boy Vincent, the alive Vincent van Gogh, comes into the world a year later, and there is his name and his birth date, that same birth year, on a headstone. And I feel like that probably messes you up as a child because he essentially was like the replacement. And again, his parents were pretty strict, a little severe, especially his mother. I have a little window here popping up. Sorry. So again, he did draw, painted a little bit as a hobby, mostly drawing. But he didn't really take it seriously until his 20s. We'll get to that. He did consider becoming a priest. He did not want to learn Latin, though, which kind of a problem. So he kind of never passed there's some sort of exam that you had to take, and he was just kind of like, all right, well, I'm going to go do my own thing. And the church didn't really like that. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Again, this is just a rundown, sort of a down and dirty. I don't want to say it's an introduction to Van Gogh. I'll just tell you right now, we're not going to talk about everything. Yes, we'll talk about Starry Night. There's so many greatest hits that we could be here for hours, but I really kind of like picked and chose to kind of show a natural progression in his art as reflected in his life. He also finished about 2,000 works of art and then left many hundreds of drawings. So we could be here for a week. I don't have time, unfortunately. Maybe one day do a whole Van Gogh, the seasons of Van Gogh, but not today. But so his early work really focused a little bit more on peasant life. He used very warm tones. He didn't really use visual brushstrokes. So, you think of a painting, the paint is smooth, sort of like scholarly, kind of by the book. A painting. Looks like life, cool. And then he becomes Van Gogh as we know him as his art evolves. His probably most loved, I would say, confidant was his brother Theo, who was a couple years younger than him, who worked as an art dealer. He was actually very successful, not like extravagantly wealthy, but he did give his brother Vincent a stipend because Vincent kind of jumped around a lot. He was almost, let's say, semi-nomadic. He moved very many places. Unfortunately, we're going to have to skip a lot of it just because he'll live here for 3 months, and then he moves in this place for 3 months, and he was just jumping around constantly, and he didn't make a lot of money from his painting. So his brother Theo basically gave him an allowance. But he wrote letters to Theo all the time. He wrote probably about, I think it's 400-ish letters to his brother, and Theo kept them. Him and his wife just kept them. They didn't really see a need to get rid of them. And Van Gogh, or Vincent, would write to his brother so often that Theo only wrote like 60 in response. And it wasn't that like he didn't care. It was just like he would get so many letters from his brother at one time that he was like, all right, okay, well, I have a backlog. Let me write you one, kind of a thing. Vincent didn't really keep his brother's letters. I imagine some of that had a little bit to do with his nomadic life. His letters are collected. His letters to Theo are collected. They have been collected in various editions by various people. I absolutely recommend you read them. He was a very skilled artist, but he was a very skilled writer, and I don't think he necessarily gets the credit for that that he maybe deserves. We'll look at his writing a little bit. So his art, when he starts, kind of taking it seriously, he'd been a hobbyist for a number of years. So it starts off as, I would say, fairly unremarkable. And then gets to the Van Gogh that we know and love, his contrast, the swirls, very dynamic, all this movement and everything. And we're really going to look at how he got from A to B. A lot of his early works have been lost. Some of that has to do, I think, again, with his nomadic lifestyle. Number two, he used very, very cheap materials because he couldn't afford anything. So also keep in mind, because he had no money, basically, he had his little allowance, he was buying very cheap materials, and because they were so cheap, his oil paints, the colors that we see today are very damaged by light, that they have faded a lot over time. So they look very, very different from what they would have looked like when he was actually painting them. Okay, so letters, we got to that. And he loved selfies. He's the selfie guy. Painted a lot of them. But you know what? When you're poor and can't pay models, what do? You grab a mirror. All right. So one of my favorite quotes by him, he says, "If you hear a voice within you say you cannot paint, then by all means paint, and that voice will be silenced." I will say he was known to kind of go on benders a little bit. He drank very, very heavily, and mostly subsisted on bread and cigarettes and coffee. So maybe he was hearing other voices. I don't know. That's up for debate. Another one of his quotes that I really liked is, "Great things are done by a series of small things brought together," which we will definitely see in his art as we go along. So just to give you an idea of like kind of where he started as a hobbyist, here's just a drawing that he did of a canal. He was Dutch. They have their canals, that happens. In 1873, it's fine. It's pretty good, even, it's pretty good drawing. Good. He's got the perspective going on. He's got his vanishing point in the distance. We have the suggestion of a windmill to the left. We got some birds. We got a little house shack situation. Got a little dock with a little, I'm like gesturing towards my computer. We have a little dock with a gate on the right. We got some fences. This is pretty good. He's got the reflections in the water. It's pretty good for somebody who's generally self-taught. He hadn't really gone to any art school or formal lessons at this time. He was kind of doing his thing. He was drawing. Some of us draw, we draw. A little bit of a later one, mills in the neighborhood of Dordrecht. I am not Dutch. From 1877. I really like this one because, yeah, he was a hobbyist, but there's something just kind of like very good about the understanding that we can kind of tell this is probably like a stormy landscape. You have these windmills in shadow. We have these kind of dark clouds rolling in from the right hand side. So like even when he is just in his very, very hobbyist phase, he's got ideas going on about light and shadow and composition that maybe he doesn't kind of understand how to execute them fully, but he's already kind of figuring out how to describe things. So 1879. Where's Vincent? Vincent is in a coal mining town in the Netherlands, and he decides, you know what? I've had a number of failed businesses. He worked for an art dealer for a little bit. He was rejected by a couple women, had some tumultuous affairs. And he said, you know what? I'm going to throw myself into religion. Again, he tried being a priest, didn't really like the whole established priesthood thing, didn't want to take the exam. So he said, all right, I'm going to like become a self-proclaimed like monastic lifestyle monk person. So he moves to this town, and it's a poor mining town. Everybody's working in the field or in the mine, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to live amongst these poor people. He sells like most of his belongings. He's sleeping on straw. He's not really buying possessions. He's completely embracing this monastic lifestyle, and the people in the town actually really like him. But the church kind of catches wind of this, and they're like, "Ooh, buddy, can't really have that. We're not really trying to go for like the poor person angle with the church. You're kind of being like a martyr here. We're not. You can't be one of us." And he doesn't take it well. Also, Vincent doesn't take it well is kind of a running thread throughout his life. I am not a medical professional, not a mental health professional, but I do believe he definitely had some sort of, in 1879, they weren't really diagnosing mental disorders, but I do believe he had some sort of bipolar. I don't remember if it's one or two, because he would go through these like days and weeks and months of these very, very low fugue states, and he would just be horribly depressed and withdrawn, like self-abusive in a way. And then he would break through and he would just have days and months of mania and just prolific work and just, oh, nothing could stop him kind of thing. His moods just, they were everywhere. There was definitely something going on. But again, he loved coffee and cigarettes and alcohol. Maybe he could have done well for a vitamin. I don't know. So anyway, the church says, no thanks, Vincent. We're good. So he basically feels rejected. He doesn't take it well, but he decides, all right, if I can't become a priest, I can't do this, I can't do that, I will become an artist. So at this point, he throws himself headfirst into his work. So he says, I felt my energy revive and said to myself, in spite of everything, I shall rise again. I will take up my pencil, which I have forsaken in my great discouragement, and will go on with my drawing. From that moment, everything else has seemed transformed to me. And really, it did. This is really, he's had a couple little turning points in his life, little, not so much sharp turns, but just little, little jug handles. But this one was a very, very sharp turn. He said, all right, this is me. I'm running into this. I'm gonna be an artist. So he moves around. He goes to Paris for a little bit and he starts painting. He starts taking some art lessons. Here's a work from 1882 that the first time I saw this, I was like, that's not a Van Gogh. No, it's not. It is. So we can see 1882, he's been drawing seriously for 2 years, but he does have all these years of hobbyist art under his belt. So he knows what he's doing. You can see he's very technically skilled. It's a very sort of by the books. I don't want to call it, I mean, the composition is interesting. I like the composition. This is a point of view. It's a perspective you don't typically see in art, but it is just kind of by the books, academic. The grass is green, the sky is blue, the rooftops are described, as they look. There isn't really anything I would say remarkable here aside from the composition, but it's a good sorry, my earbud is bothering me. It's a good sort of touching stone, touch point, my brain's not working. Just to see where he kind of was, where his skills lied, and he was pretty good, hey, listen, it's a good painting. It's a good painting. But again, would you look at this and say, oh, that's a Van Gogh? Absolutely not. So to become Van Gogh, you have to know where you have to begin somewhere. And to stylize your art, you have to know how to do it right first. Because when you start stylizing it, you're making very conscious choices of what you're dropping and what you're keeping. So he was skilled. He knew what he was doing. We can see this and go, yep, that's a rooftop. Those are the colors that everything is supposed to be. Cool. So he says, occasionally in times of worry, I've longed to be stylish. But on second thought, I say, no, just let me be myself and express rough yet true things with rough workmanship. So yes, he had the ability to be somewhat classic, somewhat academic, very, literally descriptive in his color choices and things like that. But did he want to be? Not necessarily, but when you're in art school, this is what they're teaching. They're teaching, one-to-one. This is what's found in nature. This is what you see. This is what you paint. So allegedly, I was actually just reading this last night. There's a story that goes in these art classes he was taking. The assignment was to paint a likeness of the Venus de Milo, which you all know, it's the naked lady statue. She doesn't have arms. Beautiful, classic nude, whatever. And everybody's like, all right, I drew, I painted. Here it is, one-to-one. This is Venus de Milo. And he submitted a drawing of a very sort of rough-hewn, sort of scraggly, rough charcoal drawing of a peasant woman, saying like, no, this is a real woman. This is beauty. These are the people. And again, everyone's like, okay. By all accounts, he was very difficult to work with, to deal with. He was known to be extremely argumentative. I don't know if you read any of his biographies, there's so many times where they're like, oh, and he left due to a disagreement, or, he had to leave here because he didn't get along with anybody. And you're like, all right, kind of seems like you're doing it to yourself at this point. But he was just so driven, but driven in such a way that he had his own complete vision And I think he knew what he wanted to be doing, but just kind of wasn't sure how to get there. So that was probably very, very frustrating to him. And again, classical art in the mid 1800s, they're like, you're doing classical nudes, you're doing biblical paintings, you're doing history paintings. Nobody wants to see peasant people and things like that, and the things that he was actually interested in. But still, he keeps going. He paints these. It's a landscape. He's got some houses. Is it a beautiful, idyllic land? No. It's, you can tell this is a poor plot of land. These people are not rich. They're not wealthy. This is not who you typically see in art at the time. And he was like, no, these are my people. This is what I'm painting. Just like this weaver. You don't paint industrial stuff. It's not considered attractive. It's not biblical. It's not historical. It's not what the attitudes in art dictated were fit for public consumption visually. But he says, no, again, these are my people. These are my salt of the earth, the people that I want to minister to, the people that I want to depict in my art. And he just barrels on ahead. I also really like this painting because the way he describes the weaver's face, it's like almost geometric. There isn't a lot of detail here, but you can tell, like you know this person's looking directly down at the loom, I guess. I don't weave. But he's using very few strokes to actually do it. The floorboards are just a few strokes of certain colors sort of leading away from the viewer. And again, these are very warm, very earth tones. I assume they were probably pretty accurate. I assume that weavers were not working in beautiful scenic factories. They were probably working in dimly lit, gas lamp conditions that looked a lot like this. And so his first successful painting that was exhibited was this, The Potato Eaters of 1885. And again, the first time I saw this painting, I was like, that's a Van Gogh? No, it's not. It is. Through his connections that he had made through his travels, through art school, just joining various sort of artist collections and getting in fights with everybody, he did have the opportunity to exhibit this painting, I believe, in France. And this is a really good sort of summary of his life up until now. So we have these peasant people. I don't really know what else to call them, unfortunately. They're peasants. And they're literally eating potatoes. The Potato Eaters. It's a very straightforward painting that kind of doesn't seem like a lot, but there is a bit going on here. So we know he's interested in, let's say beauty in sort of rough natural places. So we have these 5 figures with one has their back to us, and the rest we see their faces, and they're very sort of, they're modeled very roughly. They look like they could have been carved out of wood, almost to the point of being like primitive, almost animalistic. They are eating potatoes because that's what they farmed. This is what they grew. This is what they harvested. You can tell, look at their hands, their knobby knuckles, I would say even rheumatic most likely. And I like the hands of the woman second to the left feeding the gentleman, because you can look at her face and she's probably got the softest features there, so she looks kind of young. But if you look at her hands tell you that she's had a much more difficult life. Look how knobby they are. They're very like shriveled in a way. And they sit at this table, they share their bread and I assume tea or coffee under this one little gas lamp in this tiny, tiny room. They're all cramped together. Nobody here looks comfortable except maybe the figure with her back to us, but she seems to be furthest away from the light. They almost look like they came from the earth itself. To make a weird analogy, much like their potatoes. These people are of the earth. They come from the earth. They are fed by the earth. And these are his people. These are who he's interested in. These people who are not part of, metropolitan, fancy, wealthy, rich life. Like this is his bread and butter up until now. And this painting wasn't sold, but it caught some waves. It kind of put his name out there a little bit more, and it was pretty good. Although he was sending paintings to his brother Theo to sell because Theo was an art dealer, and they kind of weren't moving, and Vincent was like, hey, maybe you're not trying hard enough to sell my paintings. And it's like, buddy, the world wasn't ready for it yet. Just, keep going. But anyway, The Potato Eaters, 1885. Again, earth tones, very rough. His brushstrokes are not very, very visible, but they're still definitely there. They're a little bit more obvious for sure than that roof painting that we saw. That was very smooth, very matter of fact. So he's bringing more texture into his art. Good example is also a geranium in a flower pot, which he really starts making his brushstrokes visible in a much bigger way. You can see, especially in the background, those carmine reds. You can assume that the paint was applied very thickly. This almost looks unfinished. It's not unfinished, but it almost looks unfinished with how sort of rough it is. But he is moving a little bit away, or he's starting to play with contrast a little bit more. You know, you have this dark red carmine background. You have the whitish yellows of the geraniums, which again, because his paint was super duper cheap, this would have looked completely different. So kind of doing our best on the recreations here. But again, we have contrast starting to come in just a little bit, and those much more visible brushstrokes. So in the mid to late 80s is when he kind of starts pushing much farther away from the academic, you know, one-to-one, everything has to look exactly what it looks like. You know, he's starting to make interpretations in the way he describes things. And in 1886, he paints this self-portrait, one of many, because again, when you're poor, when you're a struggling, starving artist, you can't afford to pay models. So you paint yourself and you paint your friends. So go back for a second. So his face is pretty, I would say, one-to-one, pretty realistic. You can see some brushstrokes sort of around his ear, especially. I love that red right in the center of his ear. And especially in his beard. He's got these visible brushstrokes, and then around his collar and the lapel of his jacket. But I just wanted to show you this one because we're gonna watch his self-portraits really evolve as his style evolves. And again, I love the red ear, just great. The red of the corner of his eye, I think, is wonderful too. And it's just little tiny strokes, but they just, if they weren't there, you know, there would just be something missing. And I just like this painting. I want to show it to you guys as an example of him really trying, or really pushing his brushstrokes to be more descriptive, but with minimal effort, if that makes sense. So instead of blending all of his colors, he, you know, so let's talk about the front. Oh, I have a mouse. The front of his shoe right here with like the little white highlight. He's just making a bunch of stroke, and he's not blending them. So he's allowing his brushstrokes to be visible. And I also like, you can see some of the yellow background paint through the this greenish color, which again I assume maybe was more of a little bit of like a coppery brown, but I assume it was probably oxidized over time because again, cheap paint. But I love these paintings of these shoes. They look very modern, actually, almost like a Chelsea boot. Like I would wear them. They're cool. But just the way that he starts describing things, and you can see the way his brushstrokes, especially like the roundness of the toe, kind of contour each part of the shoe. So he's kind of thinking about movement a little bit more instead of just here's a flat color, you know, throw a line on it, we're done. So we're starting to be careful about the way our brushstrokes are describing the shapes in terms of their shape. So he's not just putting a bunch of lines on a circle and that's round. No, we're moving our brushstrokes around the forms. So there's starting to be a sense of movement here. And here's an important one. So this is Banks of the Seine in the spring, 1887. So late 80s. He's done some traveling. He's made some artistic connections. He's doing his thing. I love this painting. You can tell that this was a sunny day, but it's so sunny that there are all these shadows here on the right-hand side. Ooh, the light just turned off. Whatever. There's all these shadows here on the right-hand side, but through the composition, you can see it's sunny through. We're back. It's sunny through the trees. He's got this bridge above the banks of the Seine, which is a river, and the way that he's describing the leaves here are just little tiny strokes. And again, you can see towards the top right, the top left, these leaves almost painted individually. It's not like he's taking a big fan brush that adds a lot of texture and just kind of going like a Bob Ross, which I love Bob Ross. Nothing wrong with Bob Ross. But he tends to sort of group things where he's really going in here with individual brushstrokes and kind of painting them in a direction where you can almost feel the breeze coming through these trees. They're sort of the way they move around the canvas. The way they move around the canvas really sort of suggests like a gust of wind coming through. You can almost feel them moving like in a breeze. And I believe, and I just caught this, up on the bridge here seems to be two figures walking, which I really like. But again, minimal strokes describing everything. And he's starting to layer his colors a little more. These colors are not one-to-one. Trees obviously do have yellows and blacks and greens, but not to this extent. And again, cheap paint. But this is not a one-to-one translation of what he's seeing. It's more of just he's evoking this feeling of these sun-dazzled trees in the spring on a warm day, I assume, with the sun shining through. What is that? It's kind of like Impressionism. So the Impressionists, I'm sure you've all heard of the Impressionists. The Impressionists, basically what they were doing was they were also rebelling against the popular school of art, which is again history paintings, biblical paintings, portraits, very formal, what we think of like stuffy classical art. So they're taking subjects from real life, they're painting them very, very quickly. They are using short, thick brushstrokes like Vincent's doing. They're remaining visible. Again, they're moving away from their classic subject matters. No allegory, no history, no nothing. They're usually doing landscapes, and they tend to go outside to do them. Whether they finish the entire painting there, whether they're just kind of taking notes. They're not just painting from memory. They're not painting from another drawing or another painting or anything. They're actually going out into nature and painting what they see. But they're using somewhat naturalistic colors. So they're not really so much playing around with the colors of things as they are with the technique. So again, visual brushstrokes, they're painting very quickly, wet paint on wet paint. And they're very interested in light and shadow and depicting them as they change. So this is Impression Sunrise by Claude Monet, typically known as the first popular Impressionist painting, and it's a sunrise over an inlet or a bay, whatever the term would be. And we have pretty literal colors here. You can imagine it's kind of hazy, maybe a little foggy. We have the yellowish haze. We can see that very red sort of coin of a sun rising on the horizon. We have the blue smokestacks from what I assume is some sort of industrial factory. And then we have the shadows of the boat. But generally, I know the water and the light and the sun kind of do things to colors, but you can really kind of find these sorts of colors in a scene like this. So when Vincent is in France and he's traveling around, he is in contact with the Impressionists. He's in contact with the Impressionist painters. He is getting into fights with them. He's annoying them, whatever. So he is aware of Impressionism, and that's how we kind of get this. It's the banks on the Seine in the spring as the influence of his time around the Impressionists. But what he starts doing, which is what I assume we all kind of know him for, is what he does is he takes these impressionistic techniques, the thick globs of paint, the going outside, these short brushstrokes, and he infuses them with more I don't say more meaning, but he's more interested in the emotion and the wonder that these scenes might evoke, rather than just saying, yes, it's the sun rays, yes, these are flowers, whatever. This is what I felt. And due to that, he is much more reliant on sort of unnatural color choices. So this is Starry Night Over the Rhine. I don't speak German. And obviously would not look exactly like this. But there's a sense of wonder one might have had while looking out over the river like this and seeing the stars and seeing the lights. And that's really what he's interested in capturing, is sort of the feeling and the mood. And here we got another self-portrait. So this is Self-Portrait with Straw Hat, 1887. This one's actually at the Met, or it was a couple years ago. I think the Met is open. I haven't been there in a long time. So if you make your way over the Met, take a look at this one. It's very, very cool. Especially since, so if you look at the white lines in his face, there's sort of that pinkish color that comes through, that if you keep looking, it's kind of everywhere. That's the canvas, actually. So not only at this point is he allowing the paint and the brushstrokes to be visible, is he's also allowing the canvas to be visible, which you don't typically do. Typically, a canvas would be primed. I'm not 100% sure why this canvas would be unprimed, and priming it prepares it for, gotta fix my mic. Sorry. Priming a canvas prepares it for the application of paint. Could it be because he couldn't afford any? Maybe. Not unlikely. But this one is very cool, and it's just such a neat departure from the other one that we had looked at. And I love the movement of his hat. The straw hat is almost something like a halo, just the way the strokes sort of describe the curve. And again, there's just something very, very, very dynamic about these brushstrokes. They're in constant movement. This sort of art just sort of radiates in and of itself with the way that these brushstrokes are applied. And he just adds colors right on top of one another. You can see, so in the bottom right, his left shoulder, he's got that yellow reflection. The sunlight just sits on his shoulder. It's not blended in. It's just there. It's just it dapples the rest of his clothes. Excuse me. And he's also, again, using unnatural color choices. So the green is what he chose for his shadows here. Shadows are not typically green, especially when they're on yellow, but he pulls them through, on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side of his face, our left, underneath his chin, on the jacket, on the underside of his hat. So he's really, really, really starting to push his style a lot more now. And so he says, the uglier, older, meaner, iller, poorer I get, the more I wish to take my revenge by doing brilliant color, well arranged, resplendent. And I would say he succeeds. He's just very, I don't want to say he's spiteful, but the more people kind of told him no, the more he really, really pushed himself and threw himself into his art and was like, oh no, I'm gonna not deal with this, and I'm just gonna overcome it with my art, by painting, by pushing, I'm just gonna keep going. Which I kind of admire in a way. But one of the techniques he uses is pointillism, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. Pointillism is the use of rapidly applied, closely spaced dots or small brushstrokes of individual color to create an image. We saw this with the Impressionists. They used this technique to express the changing qualities of things like light and shadow and water. We saw in the trees, he had those very pointillistic leaves. And this is another self-portrait that I really, really like. There's so many colors in it. It's almost like a parrot or a peacock. These brilliant jewel tones that are applied in little tiny individual dots. And this one, he doesn't have the canvas showing through really. You can see in the top left and a little bit on the left-hand side where the edge of the canvas would have been. And he really does cover it for the entire portrait here. But every one of these little tiny dots is an individual brushstroke. And again, that's it. He's not blending anything anymore. You're going to see every individual stroke he makes. He applies his paint very, very thickly, sort of wet on wet, no blending. This is what it is. Here's a nice little close-up. Again, just that red in the corner of his eye that I always love that he takes care to put in there, and the red ear. I imagine he was very pale, and that fiery red hair, coupled with his alcoholism, I imagine he was probably very red faced, and his ears are probably very red all the time, and he didn't shy away from that, which I appreciate. I think it's kind of cool. But again, we're pushing away from our naturalistic colors. So yeah, we have his flesh tones in here, but we also, again, we have our greens, we have these oranges, we have yellows. So he's interested in describing things in more sort of dynamic terms. And so here's the thing about our boy Vincent. He only sold one major painting in his life. This guy, who is arguably the most famous painter in the world, a household name easily, everybody knows him. This is the only painting he ever sold in his lifetime. He did a couple little commissions of portraits and things here and there, but this is the only one he ever really displayed and sold. This is the Red Vineyards from 1888. So let's look at this one, because it really is a great culmination of everything up until this point. So the Red Vineyards, so we got more peasant people working in the vineyards. So it's his interest in this class of people in Europe, the very salt of the earth, manual labor workers, but men and women working in this vineyard. And you can tell it's very, very hot. We have this oppressive eye of this white hot sun sitting in this gold field that really just beats on everybody. We have it's reflected in the water. It colors the foliage of the vineyard itself to this field of fire almost. You can tell this was not easy work. It was probably kind of miserable, actually. But these are what these people did. They worked hard. He uses these blues in the clothes of these people to really contrast, to really pull them out of this sort of fiery landscape, to really highlight them. And you don't want to miss them, because they're the important subjects of this painting. It's called the Red Vineyards, yes, but who's in the vineyard, who's actually doing these things, is the subject matter that he was so strongly interested in. Although we do have, I like the contrast of the trees at the top left, these cool blues. As you can tell, they probably provide a lot of shade, and these people are going to be very happy to go sit under it when the day is over. But it's not over. I'm not 100% sure if this would be dawn or dusk. I hope it's dusk and they can wrap up and go home, because it looks like they had a really, really rough day. But again, this is the only painting that he sold, and it sold for 400 francs in 1888, the equivalent of about $1,000 today. So not much. Excuse me. So he said, one can speak poetry just by arranging colors well, just as one can say comfort in things in music. So he's trying to express and evoke feelings with his art, with arranging his colors with brushstrokes, in the same way a musician might take a classical piece or an instrumental piece of music and say that they're expressing this and the other. He's just very interested in, again, emotion, in feeling. So 1888, he also paints these sunflowers. And I want to show you guys these because number one, it's just a great painting. It's very classic. Number two, again, because of his very cheap paint, it would have looked a lot better in 1888 and maybe for a few years after. And number three, I like that, yes, they're sunflowers, but they're kind of like, it's not like a great arrangement of sunflowers, like if you were to get like an arrangement of flowers, you'd hope it looked a little better than this. But that was, again, a sort of commitment to being like, you know what, I'm not going to paint everything beautiful. I'm not going to paint everything, as the ideal. We got these sunflowers, probably like shoved them in a vase. He wasn't a florist, he wanted to paint sunflowers in 1888 in advance of his friend Paul Gauguin joining him to live with him in what he wanted to have was he basically wanted to have like a commune, an artist commune, and was like, yes, we're going to live together. We're going to get other artists. We're going to draw. We're going to paint. It's going to be a great time. But he kind of couldn't get anybody to follow him on that dream. But so he did say, now that I hope to live with Gogh in the studio of my own, I want to make decorations for the studio, nothing but big flowers. So he painted these flowers for the studio. And we'll get to Gogh in a second. We're just going chronologically. This is the Night Cafe, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen, if not all of you. I really like this painting. It's kind of great. It's garish. It's very rough. It sort of hurts the eyes a little bit. I imagine it was very, very bright and almost technicolor when he painted it. The perspective. So we've seen in his paintings, he knows what he's doing in perspective is concerned, but he starts kind of pushing it a little bit. So this pool table in the middle of the room, not quite what it should look like. It's a little bit sliding towards the viewer in a way it shouldn't. We shouldn't be able to see the entire thing on the top. The tables and chairs towards the front of the room are not great perspective. But I'm not condoning this, but like imagine if you just walked into the Night Cafe after a drink. What would after a couple drinks, what would the Night Cafe look like? Might it look a little wobbly? Perhaps. Might the lights hurt your eyes a little bit? Maybe. And this is kind of the feeling that he wanted to evoke. This was really not so much a cafe as it was like a dive bar at the end of the night. We got those two shady figures. I don't want to call them shady. We got the two figures at the right. I imagine hunched over after an evening of drinking, probably talking in hushed tones. Maybe one really wants to go home. We have the poor Night Cafe manager. He's kind of standing here looking at us as we walk in the door, and he's like, man, like more, We got this guy over here on the left, slumped over at his table, and the gentleman and his lady pal in the back and the left here, I imagine, also speaking in hushed tones, probably in the back of the room at a private table for a reason. Again, we have liquor on the tables. We have this abandoned pool table. We have the lights giving off these rays that evoke a lot of movement with these short strokes. They're very, very dynamic. And he says, in my picture of the Night Cafe, I have tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. So I have tried to express, as it were, the powers of darkness in a low public house. Yeah, this is kind of a seedy place. I think he definitely succeeded here. So let's talk about Paul Gauguin. All right, Paul Gauguin lived with Vincent for a whopping 63 days in 1888, and Theo paid him to do so, which is, it's kind of a bummer. It's like when your mom tells you to, like, hey, go play with that person because they don't have a lot of friends. So again, Vincent loved Gauguin, loved his artwork, huge fan, really wanted to create this like artist commune, but was also suffering like various mental breaks and was in and out of the hospital for things like syphilis and gonorrhea. And Theo was like, all right, Gauguin, I will pay you, just go hang with my brother for a while, please, just keep an eye on him. And Gauguin says, yes, I will. Gauguin was not a nice guy, by the way. But Gauguin was a post-impressionist like Van Gogh. Again, interested in evoking feelings and things more than painting one-to-one. They painted together, they lived together, they argued all the time and did not get along. And then in late 1888, they got into an argument when a manic Vincent van Gogh sliced off his own earlobe and handed it to a local prostitute and said, keep this carefully. Thus, the whole, cutting off the ear thing. That was an argument with Gauguin. After that, Gauguin says, all right, that's it. I'm out. Sorry, guys. And he leaves. But Gauguin, this is just to give you an idea of what Gauguin was working on, by the way. This is probably one of his most famous paintings. This is Vision After the Sermon, Jacob wrestling the angel. I put a red line on there. The idea is there's a sermon held, and afterwards you have the congregants in such religious rapture that they are actually witnessing a Bible tale. The perspective is all kind of wonky. We're more concerned with the idea that these women are congregated together, and this is a vision that they share together. Again, the colors are kind of garish, not one-to-one. But again, we're really more about the emotion here. And Vincent loved this guy, was super into him. I will say, Paul Gauguin, later on in life, abandoned his wife and children and moved to Tahiti, I believe, and spent the rest of his life sleeping with underage prostitutes and died of syphilis. So, not a great dude there. Him and Van Gogh probably were just like a perfect storm of ego and opinion and just wanting to fight whoever, sort of a thing. It was probably not a good time. But thanks, Theo. He tried. Let's see. Okay, so in advance of Gauguin coming, Vincent also painted not only the sunflowers, but this portrait. And they had painted portraits for each other, but this is one that he paints in advance of Gauguin, dedicates it to him. I really like all of these the brushstrokes that we can see in the background, because you can see even when he's trying to use what we would consider a solid color, he is putting lighter and darker tones in there, and we still have that sense of movement even when it's supposed to be like a flat color. We have our visual brushstrokes. We can see his face is very, very drawn, and he always had these high cheekbones, I believe, but at this point he almost looks sickly, and he was basically going on benders, and it probably wasn't great for him. He really wasn't taking care of himself. That's part of the reason why Theo was like, hey, Paul, please go live with my brother, check up on him. Didn't work out. But this is the house that they lived in. This is the yellow house in Arles in France that Vincent was just like, yes, gonna be my commune. This is gonna be awesome. We can see again, he can do perspective. We know he can do perspective, but he just kind of tilts everything just a little bit. We have the side of the houses that really shouldn't be facing us as much as they are, but they are. And again, I just wanted to show you guys this because you can really see, well, number one, this is the house that he hoped to, sort of cultivate. But again, even when he's using what is supposed to be a solid color, he puts a bunch of colors in there just to kind of bring it forward and allow texture to kind of come through. And this is the bedroom in Arles. I think there's a museum where you can actually see like a recreation of this. I've seen pictures. It's kind of neat. But again, we have this wonky perspective, kind of listing towards the viewer. The wall right across from us seems very, very short, kind of in contrast with the bed itself, because the bed seems long, but then when you kind of look at the wall right next to it, you're like, wait, that doesn't add up visually. But he's got these visual brushstrokes. Again, he's not really interested in the reality as much as he is really just describing the feeling of places. This small sort of cozy bedroom, this warm yellow bed. We have the sunlight coming through the window. These art pieces on the wall that I assume he liked, just full of sort of comfort objects. And I really like the way he did the floor, because he seems to have just done these sort of running brown brushstrokes and then floorboards, and he just kind of threw some green lines in there. Kind of clever. I like it. So in the aftermath of this whole manic episode, cuts off his ear, bandages his ear, Gauguin leaves, and he paints self-portrait with bandaged ear. And because he was using a mirror, it was not his right ear, which I thought like I was cool for a long time because I have like a sort of wonky ear, and I was like, oh, we're like weird ear friends. And then I was like, oh wait, no, it's actually his left. So really it was his left ear that he sliced his lobe off of. And I really like it. It's like so goofy almost, this painting. But in the background also you can see this is actually a poster of a Japanese woodblock print. And he did really, really like those. He had very strong interest in them. And I should have probably put some in here. But they use sort of very sort of solid, flat colors that are, not based in reality. Your sky is like extremely blue. Your grass is all green, sort of a thing. And he did pull some influence from there. They also have, outlines that you can actually see, especially along his coat and like the top of his hat. He's starting to kind of line things a little bit. he's allowing, so we have these brushstrokes that are describing the objects, but also we're starting to kind of describe around them a little bit. So I just wanted to include this quote. I think it's very beautiful. He says, painters, to speak only of them, being dead and buried, speak to a following generation or to several following generations through their works. Is that all, or is there more even? In the life of a painter, death may perhaps not be the most difficult thing. For myself, I declare I don't know anything about it, but the sight of the stars always makes me dream in as simple a way as the black spots on the map, representing towns and villages, make me dream. Why, I say to myself, should the spots of light on the firmament be less accessible to us than the black spots on the map of France? Just as we take the train to go to Tarascon or Rouen, we take death to go to a star. What's certainly true in this argument is that while alive, we cannot go to a star, any more than once we're dead would be able to take the train. So it seems to me not impossible that cholera, the stone, consumption, cancer are all celestial means of locomotion, just as steamboats, omnibuses, and the railways are terrestrial ones. To die peacefully of old age would be to go there on foot. Just read his journals. Just some really profound stuff in there. So before we lead up to the pièce de résistance, we see that he's got an interest in the stars, and we saw that also in his Starry Night Over the Rhone. It seems to me that he does look up very often. He looks at the sky, he looks at the stars, he has very deep thoughts about them. It seems to be some sort of comfort that's brought to him by the sight of a night sky. And I don't know how much this conflicts with his thoughts on religion, but to him, when we die, like, that's where we go. It's the same as taking the train from Woodbridge to Penn Station. Once you die, your soul is then on its journey to its celestial destination. So he already has thoughts about the stars, about the night sky, about perhaps the implications of such things. And so he paints it. Here's the thing. So 1889, let's remember what happens in 1888, the Gauguin thing. So Paul Gauguin leaves after 60-something days. Van Gogh's just hanging out in Arles, being a terror. Again, he is argumentative. He likes to fight people. He likes to drink. He likes to smoke. He likes to not eat a lot, not take care of himself. Apparently, his teeth were like just in a horrible state. He was not a charming dude. And after his episode with Paul Gauguin, the people of Arles were like, listen, buddy, we can't do this. We're not doing this. We're all going to sign a petition to ask you to leave our town. So the people of Arles basically go, you gotta leave, pal. And he does. But he doesn't just leave, he is checked into an asylum. The asylum, I believe, in Saint-Remy. Let me look at my notes, because I don't... Yes. In Saint-Remy, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I do not speak French. This is actually, if you guys don't know, this is actually the view of the village from the window of his room in the asylum. So he's locked in this place, somewhat against his will. He's locked in this place. He can't leave under these awful circumstances. He's finally getting help for his mental health. He's like, things are looking up. This is kind of a piece that expresses, I would say, comfort, especially after reading his thoughts on the stars and on, celestial bodies and on, a soul and things like that. This, to me, is a very sort of comforting painting. We have the village down there. We have the houses described very simply. Again, look at those little outlines, kind of pulled from those Japanese prints. Their roofs described in very, very, very simple terms. This thing here on the left, it's not a castle. I know a lot of people think it's a castle. It's okay. It's not a castle. It's actually a cypress tree on these very tall, skinny. I've seen them in like landscaping, kind of like an arborvitae sort of tree that grows very, very tall. It's sort of like an evergreeny looking thing. Kind of obstructs the view, but he leaves it in. This is what he sees. We have this bright, beautiful moon. All of these swirling colors really sort of evoke all this sort of divine movement of the planets, of the stars. And it's like a hug almost. I don't imagine that he would have hated seeing this every night. it's 1889, light pollution basically doesn't exist. So I'm sure looking outside, looking at the starry sky, looking out of a window at night, you get a completely different view than you would today, obviously, especially in Middlesex County. So he's in this place basically against his will, but he has access to this thing that he loves that feels very, very comforting to him. And again, we have our pointillistic, yes, brush strokes, these short visual brush strokes. We have these colors layered on top of one another. Obviously, these are not the exact colors. He's really evoking this warm, not warm. I would call it a warm blue though. This cool, sort of this comforting mood. It's blue, but it's not like, it's not a teal. It's not an electric blue. It's very sort of welcoming, like a nice little hug blue. Even the hills just sort of gently roll around, in the background underneath the sky. And the thing that I love is just how thick he applied the paint. So here is, let me see if I can remember which star this is. I believe this is the star. Yeah. I think this is the star directly to the left of the moon, if I remember correctly. But he applies the paint really, really, really thickly. He works while it's wet and then just lets it dry. And it's interesting because this painting, I think it still is there. I saw it when it was in the Museum of Modern Art. But when you have a painting like this, it's a challenge to light it, because typically museum lighting is just kind of like overhead. When you have classic paintings, like Renaissance painting, everything's very flat, so you don't really have to worry about like the way shadows are cast. But this, you have to kind of light from like several feet away at an angle, so you can't really light it from above, because then all your paint's just gonna like drop shadows over the entire thing. But I found it very, very interesting. So I believe The Starry Night is one of the best examples of sort of art through adversity, especially since he was in there getting help for his mental health. It seemed to be working. Oh, and there's the moon. And again, we have these colors right on top of one another. Even a little bit of greens in there. That could be just because of the paint mixing. But again, he's not interested in blending. He's interested in the movement, in this dynamic motion of the light around each of these figures, if you will. Again, the paint has cracked since. Kind of natural. I assume it's very hard to restore when the texture is like that. And these are some of the tree line in the hills, towards the bottom of the painting. Just simple little strokes. We're not going crazy describing things. We're just stroke, stroke, stroke. Okay, we're done. Maybe we add another layer of color on here, but that's it. He's working very, very, very quickly. There's a lot of immediacy with these. I imagine he did think about the composition, but I don't think he really spent time splitting hairs, but like, oh, where's this gonna go? Am I gonna make this? No, just paint. Just keep painting. I'm sure it was very good for his mental health too. Just want to show you Wheat Field with Cypresses, painted the same year. We have this cypress tree on the right hand side. Don't know if it's the same cypress tree. This was painted while he was still in the asylum, but when he was actually allowed to leave the building, go outside for fresh air and stuff. And again, he painted outside. He painted in plein air, where you would take all your stuff and go outside and paint what you see. So this was painted while he was staying at the asylum, but not inside the asylum. So he painted this and then went back to the asylum. But we have our cypress tree. We have our sort of lines describing the hills and the perhaps clouds in the background. I really like these clouds because they're very layered and fluffy, almost like cotton candy-y. And again, I do imagine the colors would have been a little different. He didn't suddenly come into a lot of money, so we're still working with cheap paint. And so in 1889, towards the end of his treatment in the asylum, he paints Self-Portrait Without Beard, which I think just ages him like crazy. He was only 37. It makes him look so different. And you can really see how drawn and physically unhealthy he really was. We have our brushstrokes in the background. We have him in the hair. We have him in the face. We have him in his shirt. He just kind of looks somewhat defeated. He looks tired. But again, art through adversity. He's still painting. But this is considered his last self-portrait. He didn't always date anything, and because he painted so much so often, it's a little. Some people don't believe it was his last self-portrait. Um, I do. There aren't really a lot of other contenders, honestly. But so in 1890, he paints still life vase with pink roses, which again, imagine those roses were much more pink many years ago. Um, and this is when he's about to leave, so this is a little bit more hopeful, I would say, especially when compared to Self Portrait Without Beard. There's something to be said here about life blooming and rebirth and things like that. But you can also say, yes, but it is also captive in this vase, and perhaps it only thrives after we've plucked it in this vase. Or maybe we don't get that deep with it. You know, to him, I think he was painting flowers. And I do like something I really like about this one is that he doesn't really do like shadows and light and dark here. Everything is just sort of flat colors with their sort of descriptive brush strokes. I like the outlines on the leaves here. But again, something hopeful, not as forlorn as Self Portrait Without Beard. But unfortunately, it does sort of Self Portrait Without Beard does sort of betray the trajectory of his life, because he does paint Wheat Field with Crows the next year. And before I go on, I would like to say my aunt and uncle had a print of this hanging above their couch in their living room for a number of years, and I was always like, oh, okay, that's TNTO's painting. But then I learned about it, and I was like, ooh, weird choice for a living room. Anyway, this is one of his last paintings. Wheat Field with Crows. There's just something foreboding about this one. There's some sort of storm on the horizon, and we have this very literal fork in the road. And which way are we going? We have these crows emerging from the wheat field, and crows are very often thought of as symbols of death, and I believe they were here too, because again, this is one of his last major paintings, and I do believe it truly represents a fork in the road for him, mentally, physically, spiritually, everything. His life. It's not really going too well at this point. Theo had written him a letter and said, "Hey, buddy, need to be a little bit more responsible with our money here." And unfortunately, Vincent didn't take that well, and he interpreted it as Theo was about to cut him off financially, and he would be done for, because again, he was not selling his paintings. The small commissions he was doing were barely keeping him afloat. He had almost nothing. And so he goes out to a field with his painting supplies to do some painting and a loaded revolver, and he shoots himself in the chest. And he is found later, and he lives for, I believe, 3 days. And Theo very luckily actually makes it to the hospital, and when he finds him, he finds Vincent in bed, sitting up, smoking a pipe. But it's 1890, and when you shoot yourself in the chest, we don't even have painkillers yet, I don't think, or we only had them for a little while. We certainly did not have good surgical practices, and he died 3 days later with his brother there. Very, very, very sad. Just a very tragic life, I would say. The archetype of the tortured artist. And unfortunately, Theo didn't live that much longer. He died. Let's see. Notes. Oop. He died 6 months later. Actually, I couldn't remember how long it was. He died six months later of syphilis. Actually, sorry. He died 6 months later. He was originally buried away from his brother, and then his body was moved, and they are then buried together in the Auvers cemetery in France. So Vincent and Theo, they were each other's biggest fan. They loved each other. They're buried right next to one another. And after Theo dies, his wife was the one who actually said, "You know what? I have all these paintings. I believe I assumed they would be next of kin, so they got all of Vincent's paintings. And she was the one who had actually kept all of them. She put on the first show after his death, and she's basically the reason why anybody knows Vincent van Gogh today. She kept the paintings, she kept the letters. She was the one who really, really, really kickstarted his career, more or less. You know, she'd been a fan of his since the beginning, and she at that point called in all her connects and all her favors and put on this show. And it's really, really tragic that it happened after he died. But we got Joanna Van Gogh is the one that we got to be thanking here today. So thanks, Joanna. I just want to end this on a couple of things. This is a meme that my dad sent me. Appreciated. Look at that Van Gogh. I hope this van exists and it's not just like a Photoshop, because that would be really cool. Little tiny Vincent van Gogh Funko Pop, which I think he's kind of cute. I actually don't own him. I'm done with Funko Pops. Kind of wish he came with like a little background, like an easel or something, like a little painting. They could have done better. That's all I'm saying. But he is in the straw hat. This is a self-portrait with the straw hat, Vincent van Gogh, which he's cute. He's cute. This is also, somebody sent me this a while ago. This is just him taking a selfie. And if you guys were interested in that, in any of his writing and anything, you know, we talked about tonight, we have a lot of books on Van Gogh. They're written all the time, you know. But if you are interested in his letters, we do have 2 books. One is Dear Theo, the autobiography of Vincent van Gogh, and then Vincent by himself. And they're both collections of his letters and information about his life and his paintings. And check them out if you want. You can call us tomorrow or put a hold on them tonight. Looks like we got some chats. Let me see. Sorry, it's hard to multitask. Oh yeah. Yes, they are having a Van Gogh exhibit in the city. It's like an immersive thing where they project everything. It looks super freaking cool. Tickets are really hard to find, unfortunately. But if you can get to it, I think it's been traveling a couple places all over the world. I've heard nothing but good things about it. So if you have the opportunity, Van Gogh. Anyway, but yeah, so I will be doing another one of these probably in 2 months. Maybe we'll do Picasso. Maybe we'll do Jackson Pollock. Maybe, I got a list. We'll see. But thank you guys for coming and listening to me just babble on about one of my favorite artists. Again, we got a bunch of stuff coming up. I don't have my calendar in front of me, but check our calendar. Happy Makers Month, everybody. We're gonna sign off. Again, thank you so much for coming. Hope everybody stays happy, healthy, and we'll see you around. Have a good night, everybody.